Good evening, everyone. Hello, hi. Hello, everybody. Good evening. Just wondering, we're coming up to the 7 o'clock now. If we could ask people to take their seats, that would be smashing.
Oh, they sink a little bit.
Yeah.
Well,
So, I'm going to busk a little intro.
sorry, Chris.
I'm going to busk a little intro. And
Busk a little intro.
busk.
Busk.
Yes.
Are we
yes.
online? We're online.
You are. Yeah. So, yeah. Very careful. Nothing political. Nothing political. Okay, good evening, everybody. Let me just start by saying thank you for all coming out. It's been the first time that we've all been able to get together here at Phillips London since the thing that happened before that we don't need to mention. So it's great to see so many people here. We were almost overwhelmed by the response, the speed and passion of the response from you all. So thank you. We very quickly went from 50 to 60 to 70 people, and I think we're at 80, something like now. But it shows the absolute depth of passion, not just for British independent watchmaking, but watchmaking in general. I think we've got some great sales put together, but the stars of the show were here. Any of these three watches on their own would have been a real coup. But when we put the three together, it was something different. It was something much more exciting, and we realized it told a story of its own, the three watches, and there's not really anyone better to tell that story than Roger Smith. So thank you very much for coming down. I'd like to introduce Alistair Audsley as well, ambassador for the Great Campaign. He's worked with Roger for a long, long time. You've kind of become old mates. And yeah, Alistair produced the Watchmaker's Apprentice, which is a film I guess most of you have probably seen here. So there'll be some anecdotes, I guess, from there that we'll drop in as well. Roger Smith, pretty sure you're familiar with, makes some pretty good watches. We've been lucky to handle a few here at Phillips over the years. But without too much from me, because nobody's come out to see me, I'd like to hand over to Alistair and Roger, if I may. Gents, thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Thank you. Well, this is lovely, isn't it? We never get to do this.
No. It's good.
I thought this evening it'd be really nice to go on a journey together. I don't mean that it's over and we're leaving, but as Chris was saying, we've got three very special watches, and with almost uncanny symmetry, Roger, they kind of mark milestones in your time with George. You've got obviously the spring case to be on from 1992. We've then got the millennium in 2000, and then of course the anniversary from 2010. And as I say, each one is a real milestone, I think, in your time with George. It feels like one of those books in some respects, you know, sort of the history of the world told in 12 saucepans, and that seem to proliferate these days. Before we get into those chapters, though, I suppose it would be good to maybe give us a little prologue, how you met George.
So I first met George in, I think it was about 87, 88, when I was at a college in Manchester studying horology. And there's a 3-year course. And one day we heard that this man called George Daniels was going to come to the workshops to meet the students. And he's donating a a wheel cutting engine to the college. So that was the main reason for his visit. And I was asking who George Daniels was, and somebody said that he made watches by hand. He's a watchmaker. Now, at the time, this 17-year-old, I was struggling to make components for clocks. That's what we were predominantly working on during my time at the college. And I just didn't believe that anybody could make a watch by hand. I thought it was a complete impossibility. And I didn't believe that that it was possible for anybody to make a watch by hand. And also, you must remember that back in all that time ago, watches were only ever made by industry. You know, the idea of making a handmade watch just didn't happen. And yet, apparently, the next day we were going to meet this man called George Daniels who made watches by hand. And anyway, the next day arrived, and we were in the sort of technical drawing room where I was finishing work on an escapement drawing. And this man, George Daniels, came in through the door. And he was, I remember distinctly, he was wearing his sort of trademark pinstripe three-piece suit and polished black shoes. And I just thought, wow, this person is incredible. There was something about him. He just had this sort of remarkable aura about him. And anyway, he went around the class chatting to all the students. He had this very gruff voice. He'd been battling with throat cancer for a number of years. So it's very difficult to hear what he was saying. But he got to the sort of area where I was, and I asked what was on the end of this pocket watch chain, which I could see just swinging there. And without hesitation, he just brought out this watch, which we all know, the Space Traveller pocket watch. And that was his sort of daily wear at the time. And is the moment I saw that watch, I just thought, you know, I'm standing in front of a man, a genius. And suddenly all those preconceptions were just blown out of the water. And I was just in awe of this creation that just sat on the bench in front of us. And then in that evening, he went on to deliver a lecture to the students where he's talking about his life in watchmaking and how he made his first watch I think he completed it in 1969, and that was the start of a long journey of development of the mechanical timekeeper. His real focus, he didn't want to just make watches, he wanted to make improvements to the mechanical timekeeper. He was annoyed by these people who he called these damned electricians who were ruining his world by developing the quartz wristwatch. And he wanted to fight back against that and prove that the mechanical watch was here to stay and that it's something that we should cherish and enjoy. And yeah, I remember sort of sitting in the audience and hearing about his sort of battles with the Swiss watch industry to try and convince them that the coaxial escapement was the way forward. And he had all these incredible home videos that he'd made where he'd taken the lever escapements. And I remember seeing a few of these in the workshop when I was working with him. Basically, he'd got a piece of card, made a cardboard escape wheel and cardboard lever, and then he'd filmed this on a cine camera, taking one frame at a time as the escapement was fed through. And I just remember seeing all these escapements working, and he took us on this journey of how he eventually arrived at the coaxial escapement. And I was just sat there in awe with this sort of hot and cold tingling down my spine. And that was it. That was really the rest of my life was sorted at that point.
And that really then inspired you to obviously follow George's footsteps. And you wrote to him, you visited him to see if he would, if he'd take you on as an apprentice.
Yeah, So at this time, I'd finished college. My father had bought me George's book, Watchmaking, where George describes the making of a pocket watch from start to finish. And I'm not, I've never been a great one for reading, but I read this book about 4 times, and it just blew me away. And the problem was that George made it sound so easy. And I thought, well, if George can make a watch, surely I could make a watch. That's when all the problems started. But anyway, I did write to George. At the time I was working, I'd finished college, and I was working for a trade repairers. A very nice place, nice colleagues, nice people to work with. But I was just repairing modern watches, and it really wasn't for me. And I was beginning to think, I need a little bit more in my life than this sort of work. And I wrote to George and asked if he would apprentice me. And to my amazement, I got a letter back, and he invited me over to the Isle of Man to, I think the words were, to meet and discuss my aspirations in watchmaking. And I ended up flying over and spent a wonderful day. He took me around his workshop, took me out for lunch. And at the end of the day, he said, look, I always work on my own. He said, if you want to make a watch, you've got to go out and do it. He said, I can't teach you. He said, it's such a huge task. You've got to be fully committed. And you don't need me to teach you how to do that. If you've got the drive, you'll get there. And I sort of said, right, okay, well, I'll make a watch. And went away and tried to work out how to do that.
And you spent about 18 months, didn't you, on the first one?
Yes, yeah, the first watch was made, 18 months' time. Yes.
And I remember, Roger, from when we made The Watchmaker's Apprentice, and you were talking about how you went to the Isle of Man and you presented your first watch to George.
Yeah.
And I think the one thing that stood out in my mind was the fact that not only did he, well, dare I say it, fail the watch, but I remember you saying he was actually quite angry. You felt that he was really quite put out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was. He's furious. Yes, he was, he was furious. You could tell. And actually, the next time I went with the second pocket watch, when we were walking down to the workshop, I could still, this was 5.5 years later, he was still angry. And he sort of said, what the hell were you doing bringing me that first watch? And how do you answer that? But
I suppose the timing of the first watch, when you went to visit the island, neatly intersects, I think, with the spring case tourbillon, because that would have been about the end of 91.
yes, that's right. Yeah, 91, yeah.
And I remember in conversation you saying that there was something that you could see on his bench that was covered up.
Yeah, yeah.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
I'm so sorry. I think the mic's a little bit.
Oh, right. No, that's fine.
So if we
Okay.
do a little handover.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Can you hear me better?
Seamless. Nobody saw anything.
Brilliant. No, it just appeared in my hand. It's just amazing. So yes, you've gone to the island, and I was just saying that I recollect you telling me that you saw something on the bench, and it was covered up. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Am I using this, Chris? Yes? Yes, so yeah, this was the first visit, yes. And yes, on the bench I could tell there's a watch underneath there, and looking back now, it was a wristwatch. And I said, oh, what's that? And he said, oh, you're not looking. But everything was there, the scale of the watch, and I think looking back, it was this piece here which was being made at the time. And he said it was new, it was exciting, and yeah, that's a piece.
Well, that's quite a neat segue to talk about the first of the watches on this journey. I was going to ask you to sort of walk us through that, Roger. We did a little bit of that when we made the video, actually, but I was reminded of George's 6 tenets for a watch, and I feel they're probably really apt for talking our way through the spring case. So if I get these correct, a watch had to be historic, it had to be technical, it had to be intellectual, it had to be aesthetic, and it had to have amusing and useful qualities. So for me, when I look at the spring case, it exemplifies everything that George was looking to achieve, I believe. Would you agree with that?
Certainly. I mean, George was, those of you who, I know there's several people in here tonight who knew him, he was a bit of an entertainer, and he did like to wow. And whenever, he was never shy about bringing out his latest creation. And the spring case watch, I often remember him seeing when we used to go to meet friends and so on, that he'd flash this watch, press the button, and out would pop this sort of spring tourbillon. And it's a remarkable watch. He wore it often, and it was, I think for me, what interests me about this is the story, the journey of how the watch was created, the idea that one man had this idea to create a watch, something which contained all those qualities, and he tucked himself away in that workshop on his own and made the watch. And that's remarkable. Just to give you a bit of an idea, when I was making my first 2 pocket watches, you can make a pocket watch with fairly rudimentary equipment. And a pocket watch, the tolerances of a pocket watch are down to about 1 to 200ths of a millimeter. And it's fairly easy to do that with, good basic grounding and fairly simple equipment. But when you move into the wristwatch world, suddenly those tolerances are up to 3 to 4 thousandths of a millimeter. And that's when the problems really start. And this watch is, I serviced this watch, I can't remember how long ago now, but a good time ago, probably about 15 years ago, I serviced it for George. And it was just a remarkable piece. I always sort of describe George as being a very cunning designer. He's very crafty. And every single watch that I've serviced of his up to this point has always surprised me in some way. And it can just be the way that he's created a complication within the watch. He was a master at using the fewest number of components in any watch that I've seen. And with that sort of approach, he created a very stripped back look to his mechanisms. And just created something which was, it's, in my mind, is brilliant. It's just out of this world because of the technical simplicity of what he created. And to be able to do that, you really need to master your chosen career inside out. They always talk about 10,000 hours to master any sort of level of expertise. George must have been up to 30, 40,000 hours. It was on a different level, really. So for me, the watch is aesthetically stunning, but I've had the pleasure of being inside it, and that's when you see the real beauty of what George was capable of.
Technically as well, there's additional importance with this watch because he put the coaxial escapement in the watch at arguably quite a critical time for him in terms of his campaign to really prove the coaxial escapement's superiority, dare I say it, within a wristwatch. At this time, you're of course working on your second watch, so you're back in Bolton, And meanwhile, George now has succeeded in putting his coaxial escapement into a wristwatch. And of course, we know later the coaxial was adopted by Omega. How important do you think the spring case was in the journey of the coaxial from George through to Omega adopting it?
I think probably pivotal, because at that time he was exhibiting at Basel, and there is a famous photograph of basically, I think, is an escapement model, and then out from that escapement model there were various ribbons which went to various watches that George made, and he had several pocket watches there, and then a couple of wristwatches that he'd made, and also some wristwatch conversions. So some of the branded watches that he converted to the coaxial. And I remember George telling me that, I mean, he was so driven, and he was just, he devoted his life. I mean, he invented the coaxial escapement in, I think it's 75. And he spent the next sort of 20, 25 years trying to convince a very skeptical watch industry that they should adopt this escapement, you know, is the way forward. And he was, quite remarkable in his drive, and he didn't give up. But it took somebody, a guy called Kilian Isinger, if I pronounce the name wrong, from Amiga, I believe he's in the technical department, to raise this escapement, this idea of this escapement. I think he brought it to the attention of Nicholas Hayek, who was very interested, and that sort of got the ball rolling with George's work with Amiga.
Thanks, Roger. Another aspect of the spring case, which is incredibly important for its story, is, of course, this was George's daily wearer. And we naturally ascribe so much value to who the owner of a treasured object was. I mean, I suppose the best known example of that would be the Paul Newman Daytona. And I remember recently Sean Connery's DB5 sold for considerably more than an equivalent, probably Concord condition DB5 would sell for. But I think that a watch, in a way, has a much more profound relationship with the owner than, dare I say it, a work of art or a car. And the reason for that, for me, is that it's on your wrist. It's this small, silent observer of everything you're doing, day in, day out. And this was on the wrist of the greatest watchmaker of the last 250 years. You must have seen the watch on George's wrist, and I just wonder if you have any thoughts and reminiscences about seeing the watch on George's wrist.
I think, I don't know if any of you have seen the video this evening that's appeared, that's been put together on this particular piece, but I think you need to just look at the opening 20 seconds of it, because for me that sums George up, where he sits there and he pops out the spring case and he makes some anecdote about being spoken to and obviously being bored by people talking to him. And I think that just summed up George. He was a brilliant character. He didn't suffer fools gladly. And I think whenever I see a watch or work on a watch of George, those memories obviously come back.
What was, when you started working with George, I mean, when he, again, I remember it was incredibly moving when we interviewed you for The Watchmaker's Apprentice, and you shared the moment when you presented your second watch. You went over to the Isle of Man. I cannot imagine how nervous you must have been, given the first encounter, to go back with your second watch. And George asked you, well, who made the case? And obviously you had, and went right through the watch, and it was evident that you'd climbed the mountain and you'd achieved it. And he snapped the watch shut and he said, "Congratulations, you're a watchmaker." And I remember that was an incredibly moving interview for us. So he then became very animated. You moved to the Isle of Man to work with George. What was a typical day like working with George? For you, I mean, you were a young man. You were still a very young man at this point. I mean, in your mid-late 20s.
I think frustratingly for George, I could never keep up with him in terms of hours. He liked to get into the workshop about 5 or half 5 in the morning and work right through, but I'm afraid I need my beauty sleep, so that never happened. But he was, I mean, a working day, yeah, I mean, you had to be at the bench and you had to be working. He needed to see results, and the Millennium wristwatch, which is on the right there, I was brought over to help realise that series of watches. By that time, I think George was in his early, I think he was about 72, and obviously trying to slow down a little bit by then. And he wanted to create a series of watches which celebrated the fact that his coaxial escapement had been adopted by Omega. And would I come over to help him create this series of watches? So I was obviously over like a shot. And interestingly, he thought initially that I'd be there for about a year and would make perhaps about 10 watches. But within weeks of him announcing this series, over 50 pieces had been sold. So my time on the island extended. But to get back to your original question, yeah, he demanded results. He was a very good boss, actually. I was apprehensive, of course, going to work for George. He had an incredible reputation for being a taskmaster, but all of that dissipated as soon as I walked into the workshop. He was a brilliant teacher. I mean, really brilliant, and crystal clear. And I remember on several occasions being concerned about asking him how to get over a particular issue with a watch that or a component I was making, and always very calm, never any problem, just sat down and explained brilliantly how to overcome the issue, how to maybe treat the metal or whatever. It was really remarkable. But yeah, I could never work fast enough. I mean, I think I'm quite fast by most people's standards, but it's never quite quick enough for George. But it's a good project. I really enjoyed it. And for me, when I went to work with him, I made 2 pocket watches. But I knew that if I wanted to build any sort of career, I'd have to move into the wristwatch world. And that terrified me because of these tolerances of 3 to 4 thousandths of a millimeter. I knew I couldn't achieve it with the equipment I had or the knowledge I had. So for me, that was a real pivotal moment in getting wristwatch experience.
And what was it like relocating? Obviously, you come from Bolton. You're on the Isle of Man. And obviously, that's a completely different culture. You're working at Riversdale, which in and of itself, knowing the island, Riversdale is outside the island's second town, Ramsey. It's set apart, isn't it, Roger? It's and what was life like for you at this point? Because again, you're a young guy. You'd presumably go for lunch with George and so on. So just give me a bit of a flavour of your life at that time and how you settled over there.
I mean, very well. I mean, for me, the main focus was the work. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care about what George may or may not have thrown at me. The focus was 100% work. And I probably made the mistake of getting to know some of the guys at the local rugby club, which was probably to my detriment. Not that I ever played rugby, but they used to make sure that I did go out drinking. which wasn't very good. But no, I settled into life on the island very well and thoroughly enjoyed it. And as I say, for me, it was the work. That was why I was there, and I don't think it would have mattered if I'd had to move anywhere in the world. You know, it was the work was the key thing, and I was going to make damn sure that I made the most of that situation.
Yeah. And it's a fairly rapid jump in many respects, Roger. I mean, you're making the Millennium, and the Millennium here is, I believe, was built in 2000. You made 48, I believe, plus 6, if I remember rightly, in
White.
So yellow and white. From 2000 to 2001, you embark on launching your current business, Roger W. Smith. Again, that's an incredibly fast trajectory. And how encouraging was George?
Yes, I mean, he was encouraging. He was in his sort of acts, really. He asked me what I wanted to do when I left his employment, and I had been thinking for, I think, the past year. I was sort of working on ideas of what I may do, and the idea of this Series 1 wristwatch was boiling away in my head. And he used to ask me about what I was thinking of and how I was going to progress after finishing with George, because he said, he'd had, this was his last sort of series, as we thought. But he's very generous. I mean, he did give me 2 commissions, and I think that was George's way of helping me. I mean, it's not easy when you're setting out on your own. I'd bought a house. I'd got a mortgage, and I needed to pay that mortgage. And I was basically scrabbling to try and get a series of watches together, my first Series 1 wristwatch together, and trying to keep these bills paid. But anyway, George very generously came up with this idea of me making 2 handmade Tourbillon wristwatches for him, which are now known as the blue and white. And I made those over, again, I think about 4 years. Again, not quick enough for George, but he's certainly a wonderful lifeline. He's a great supporter, and he would keep coming around to the workshop to see what I was up to and making sure that I was still working and not swanning around.
And after those first few years, I guess the pivot point for you, Roger, was the Series 2 in 2006, which then starts to draw us into the latter period of your work with George, and which leads us to the third watch in our journey, which of course is the anniversary. And we've got a beautiful example in the sale. I believe it's number 24 of the 35 that were made. The anniversary for me, when we've talked about it, there's a poignancy to it, isn't there? And but I'd love to hear your recollections of how the project came about and working on it with George.
Yes, so George would always phone very early in the morning, usually when I was asleep, and I'd suddenly sort of sit bolt upright. About 6:45 in the morning, I thought, oh God, George is on the phone. And there was always a mixture of dread with these phone calls, because he usually wanted something or needed something. And I remember whenever I'd answer it, he said, oh, you're out of bed then, are you? So I said, yes, I am, thanks, George. And anyway, he told me that he wanted to come and see me. And I thought, right, okay. So I was busy in the workshop. We were making the Series 2s, fully absorbed in this Series 2 wristwatch project. There's one of those over there. And it was interesting because he was walking around the workshop talking to the couple of watchmakers I had at the time. And by that time, we'd got this this new machine, this CNC machine, which he's really fascinated by. And I remember him sort of standing in front of this, asking about it, how it all works and so on. And he was intrigued. And anyway, nothing was said, but then a few more meetings. And one of them, he came with his good friend, David Newman, who sadly can't be here tonight. But he talked about the idea of making a new wristwatch series. And would I be interested in helping him? And at the time, I wasn't really interested because I was so committed. You know, we were trying to develop this series too. As with all new projects, you know, you really are battling to learn how to build these watches. And we were a young workshop, a young team, and we didn't really need any other challenges. But anyway, the conversation went on, and I thought I could get out of it at one point when George said, we'll do another rerun of the Millennium. By that time, Amiga had created a new movement with a new coaxial escapement in it. And this new movement was the first movement that they designed to house a coaxial escapement. So it's a fully dedicated coaxial wristwatch. And he said, what we'll do, we'll get some of those mechanisms and we'll create a series out of that. And we'll celebrate 35 years since I invented the coaxial escapement by making 35 wristwatches. And I said, there's no way I'm going to make a wristwatch with aborted movements. That's it. We've done that. We've done it with the Millennium. The only way I'd be interested is if I could design a new movement for him, which housed the coaxial escapement. So a production Daniels mechanism. And he said, yes, okay, do that. So that was the start of the anniversary project. And suddenly, I think that was 2009 when we started work on that. And again, George expected this to be done yesterday, as ever. But yeah, that was the start of that project, which we're still working on today, still completing it. 11 years after he passed away.
I remember that, by the way, that was around about the time we first met, can you believe it? 2009. I remember one of the things that we've talked about in the past was the fact that you had come up with some new modifications and evolution of the coaxial that obviously you wanted to fit. And I imagine, in a way, that must have been quite a pivotal moment for you as well, Roger, because when you dial back to first meeting George, presenting your first watch, becoming accepted as a watchmaker by George, and now moving forward, you're about to present to him an evolution of his own invention. How did that feel?
Yes, it's a challenge. As with all these things, so I started the Series 2, we delivered the first one in 2006, and it housed George's coaxial escapement. And we were making these in-house, as we still do. But we were having issues. It was a real struggle. One thing that I've come to realize is that the escapement is incredibly demanding in terms of the tolerances and so on. And I was noticing we built the first 9 watches, and each one, some were easier to bring to time, to set up than others. And this sort of issue carried on throughout the first, I suppose it's 4 years. You know, some were easy, some were difficult. We'd suddenly think that we got to a great point where the watches were going together brilliantly and is great. You could set the time very accurately, very quickly. And then the next time you were back to square one. And this was becoming a big problem in the workshop because we had a growing order book and people were getting frustrated that their watches weren't being delivered. So it's one of those moments in the middle of the night where you wake up and think, right, that's how I'm going to do it. So I came up with this idea for creating a single wheel coaxial escapement where we machine basically the upper teeth. So in a coaxial, there's the lower locking teeth and then the upper teeth, which is used for impulsing the lever and the roller. So what I was finding was it's very difficult to make sure that these two sets of teeth were concentric to each other, but also not only concentric, but also correctly angularly orientated to each other. And I thought, well, if I could come up with a way of machining this wheel as a single component, then that may make life a little bit easier. And so, the great thing about making everything yourself, the next morning I went in, I drew this escape wheel. I spent most of the night thinking about it. Went in the next day. Within half an hour, I'd drawn out the escapement as I'd planned it in the middle of the night. And by the end of the day, we had a single wheel coaxial escape wheel made. And then the following day, it was in a watch. And the transformation was astonishing. And suddenly a lot of those issues just disappeared. And is the way forward. So we started using them in our Series 2s. And so I was adamant that I wanted to use this in the anniversary wristwatch that I was designing for George. And we had long discussions about how I should, in the workshop, about how I should approach George. And anyway, we decided just to tackle it head on, which is always the best way. And I remember I phoned him and asked him if he'd be happy to come around. There's something I wanted to show him. And we got one of my Series 2 wristwatches there with a single wheel coaxial in. And I started explaining about the challenges we were having, as I have just done to you now. And I said, here's a watch under the microscope. So he examined the watch. And I said, I'd like to put this in the anniversary wristwatch. And he said, well, it's a worthwhile improvement to the coaxial escapement. So yes, go ahead. He again, that sort of really typified George. He wanted to see progression. He wasn't very protective about his ideas. He wanted to see people take his ideas and build on those ideas. And for him, it was always about the future of mechanical timekeeping. And so fortunately, a very challenging meeting turned into something which was just very straightforward. And so now, yes, we started using the single wheel in his watches.
I think it's such a beautiful way to sort of draw the circle in this story, Roger, with these three amazing watches. And it was a project that obviously went right through to George passing away. There's some poignancy, by the way, to this evening, because tomorrow is actually the 11th anniversary of George's passing. So I hope we can raise a glass to George at the end of the evening. But I think it would be really apt for the audience to perhaps ask some questions of you, Roger. And so we can hopefully pass the microphone around if anyone would like to ask Roger a question. Well, I saw you first, and then we'll go to you. Thanks, Chris. You've got the trainers on.
I've got my trainers on for Jess. Thank you.
Thanks. Roger, how do you feel now looking at your first two pieces with your eyes today?
It is actually. The first two pieces, it's all part of the journey, really. The first piece it worked just about. George said, after he sort of on that first difficult meeting, he calmed down enough to say, well, look, at least you've made a watch and it works. Put that to the back of the bench, start a new watch. And that's what I did. I remember going home and my father saying, so? And I told him, and he wasn't happy, but that was it. And I was determined to prove that I could master all these skills to make a handmade watch. So, I still have that movement at home in bits. I had no money, so I had to melt the case down for the second watch. I had to rescue certain jewels and things for the second watch. So it's in sort of in bits, but it's there. The second watch, yeah, I was pleased with that. I spent 5.5 years making it. It was remade about 4 times throughout that period. And I'd find that at the end of the first year, the watch was working and ticking well in comparison to the first watch. And but then I'd look at the parts I'd made at the beginning of the year, and they were far poorer quality than I'd just made. So I'd go back to the beginning, restart making the whole watch. And this, I remade the watch about 4 times over the 5.5 years. And it did just get to a point where I knew I couldn't do any better. That was it. I knew I'd accomplished the level that I felt I needed to achieve. So, so that was nice. I mean, but I still needed George to tell me that it was good enough. So that was the next bit.
Gentlemen.
Hi. I suppose the romantic and archetypal vision of a watchmaker is someone bent over their desk, crafting many pieces with files and polishes, etc., with an incredible array of skills. Versus there are many companies now which are playing on that image by using a lot of machinery and not necessarily doing that, but giving that impression to the customer. Where for you is the sweet spot where the two things blend? Obviously, as a single small business, you need to use modern technology in able to produce watches and actually make a living, but you do need to appreciate the craftsmanship and the quality that people are looking for in a handmade watch.
Right, how do I answer that one? Well, for me, it's always been, I mean, today we make 15 watches per year. We have 15 people in the business. 10 of those or 11 of those are watchmakers. So they are all incredibly labor intensive. So I think we do have CNC machinery. I mean, if you want to make anything more than 1 watch per year, 1 wristwatch, you need CNC, because otherwise there'll never ever be a sustainable business. You need repeatability in the raw components to make it succeed. Each of our watchmakers gets a box of components, and they are then responsible for taking those raw components through to a completed watch, fully assembled, completed watch. They have to learn how to heat treat each component, how to finish each component. And yeah, that's sort of very demanding. And am I going off point here? I'm not sure, but we could make life easier, but that would mean reducing the quality and standard of the workmanship, and I'm not prepared to do that. So a dial, for example, our simplest dial will take 3 weeks to make, and they're all hand engine turned on George's engine turning equipment. And I'm sure we could get that dial made very quickly and fairly cheaply in Switzerland. But for me, that's not what it's about. It's about trying to do the best and trying to, have the guys in the workshop. I mean, we've got an incredible team at the moment. It's just wonderful. And to see the enthusiasm in there to build these watches is, for me, incredibly exciting and rewarding. So no, that's the way it is. That's the way it'll continue.
Thank you, sir.
Firstly, thanks for a really wonderful talk. It was very moving and very interesting. I wanted to ask you, your entry into watchmaking was really trial by fire. I don't think that many people would have survived that. How different is your approach with your current team compared to George's?
Yes, you are. Yeah. I mean, it is a different business. There's no doubt about it. I mean, the people we take on, We've learned over the years to look for the right sort of people. So nowadays the main skill or quality is personality. We want somebody who can come into the workshop and obviously work to a very high standard. We can teach them the skills to do that. But we need somebody who gets on and is prepared to work and prepared to meet the exacting standards. And it is a different world to the way George was and myself. You know, we were making everything by hand. And it was actually during the making of my first Series 1 wristwatch, I had a workshop in a spare bedroom of the house that I owned. And I was sat there day in, day out, working almost 6-7 days a week, terrific hours, trying to get this watch together. And it was incredibly demanding. And I thought at that point that I wanted to eventually work with people. I wanted to share the burden. And I also felt it'd be very challenging to get people who'd be prepared to work to that standard. I mean, George was remarkable. You know, I think this is why he's the only one who's ever done what he's done. And I don't think we'll ever see the likes of George Daniels again. And he's a one-off. So just totally different. I don't know if that answers your question. Thank you.
Again, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to hear from you, and it was very interesting. You know, often you're obviously vaulted for your great successes, many of which you have, and I wonder what is it you're currently struggling with or failing on that's occupying your mind?
Thank you. I was asked that the other day, actually. And, you know, my business, the work is very different than what it was 15, 20 years ago. The business is very different. I'd say that the real challenge has been the last 20 years. That's the real challenge. Somebody was asking me about a particular watch. What were the challenges in making that particular watch? And my answer was the previous 20 years, because it takes that long to master what we're doing. I think one of the challenges has been that I've never worked in the Swiss watch industry. I don't have experience of how the watch industry works, how you approach a project. So we've had to learn everything from scratch. That may be seen as a bad thing, and a long way to get to where we've got. But I believe by going down this quite stubborn route, we've created something which is totally unique, unrepeatable anywhere else in the watchmaking world. And it's I've lost my train of thought now. But yeah, no, it's, I think had I been to Switzerland, there was a point where I could have gone to Switzerland around about the time that I was trying to ask George if he'd take me on as an apprentice. There was an opportunity for me to go. But had I gone, I think my watches would be very different today. Very different. But yeah, we wouldn't be making the Daniels or the RW Smith as we are.
Roger, just a quick question on the industry, as you were talking about. Daniels was the first independent watchmaker or modern watchmaker in the late 1960s. Then in the 90s, noughties, you had a new generation of independent watchmakers, yourself, Jorn, Voutilainen, Dufour, Orwerk, De Bethune, etc., who came to the market and who are big names now. Then there was a big gap, and the past few years, we have the likes of Frodsham, Recep Recepi, Theo Offray, etc., who are also independent watchmakers who are getting the limelight. you've lived through these basically three different periods, or you've witnessed them. What differences do you see between each of these different periods of the rise of independence?
You've got thinking time.
You could have done a few more circles there, actually. Yeah. That's a very difficult one, is that? I'll have to speak to you later, Alex. I mean, it is fascinating. It's there's no doubt George has inspired many generations now of watchmakers, and he's continuing to inspire, particularly if you look on Instagram and the number of people who are now trying to make their own watches. We're in a very different era now where, you know, as I say, we have a CNC machine. I bought my first one in 2005, and that has enabled me to become independent, sit outside of the watch industry and to make my own watches in the way that I want to make them. That's evident with the other makers that you see. You know, everyone is making, there are some really wonderful watches out there. The independent, you know, that's where it all is, in the independents. They're making remarkable watches. They have no constraints of the industry, and they are able to realize their dreams. And yeah, I mean, as you say, there are, did you just rattle off 15 makers? It's quite remarkable what's happening today. It's all very positive for the industry, for the independent sector, and I'm sure there'll be many more joining the lineup before too long. But to answer your question, it's thoroughly exciting. It's brilliant. It's what George would have wanted. He always wanted that. That's what he wanted. He wanted people to basically make watches. So it's, yeah, what a remarkable legacy he's left.
Sounds to me like a sort of the perfect note to end on in a lot of ways. We've spoken about the journey of the three watches that you and George went on and how that's kind of inspired the next generation, where things are going. Can I just squeeze in one more question, actually, because we've spoken about the journey so far. You meet George, the spring case, you and George really collaborating the millennium, you running with the anniversary, and the anniversary chapter's coming to a close now. Is there going to be a Watchmaker's Apprentice 2? How do you feel about closing that door in many ways?
Yeah, it's yes. I mean, we have drawn a line under the series now. I think we've got maybe 5 more pieces to make. But every great thing has to come to an end, and yeah, I mean, George asked me to make these watches, and I've been the team. We've all been making those watches now for 12 years now, and you know, I think great things have to come to an end, and maybe time to focus on my own work. And there's many ideas that I have out there that I just need a bit of time to focus on those. So I'm looking forward to the future, and I don't think any of us will forget George and his work in a hurry.
Okay, I'd just like to say, Roger, Alistair, thank you both so much. Funny, brilliant, really loved it. And we'd like to invite you all for some drinks, to take a look at the watches, maybe have a chat with some of these gentlemen as well. And thank you very much all for coming out, and we'll leave it there tonight.